These golden keys weigh more than they seem. For 12 years only he held them. Every morning, I heard them jingling in his pants pocket when he came down for coffee. Every night, the metallic sound when he tossed them on the nightstand. Today they rest in my wrinkled hand, and every scratch on the metal tells a story no one could imagine. His office is now mine. Everything he built with fear and violence is now mine. But the price I paid for this freedom, child. Well, some debts can only be settled with time. It was 1965, and I was Dorothy Mae Henderson, a 25-year-old girl in Cedar Grove, Alabama, raised between the smell of red clay and the sound of crickets on summer nights. Thomas Sullivan was the most respected man in town, owner of the sawmill, member of the Baptist church, always in a well-pressed suit with an enchanting smile that made the church ladies sigh. Everyone said I was lucky. "Dorothy Mae, you caught the best fish in the river," my mother joked, adjusting my wedding dress. The church was packed at our wedding. White flowers everywhere, the organ playing Amazing Grace, and Thomas looking at me like I was the most precious thing in the world. In that moment, walking down the aisle with Daddy, I truly believed I was. The honeymoon was in Atlanta, first time I'd ever left the county. He bought me a light blue dress at Rich's department store and said I was the most beautiful woman in Georgia. We moved into his house on Magnolia Street, that white two-story mansion everyone admired driving by. It had a porch with columns, a garden of azaleas always in bloom, and an office with book-lined walls where he handled business. "Here you'll never want for anything," he said, carrying me over the front threshold. The neighbors watched from their windows, envious. And really, I didn't want for anything. He brought everything. Decided everything. First, I thought it was Southern chivalry. He did the shopping in town, chose my clothes, even made appointments at Mrs. Patterson's salon to cut my hair the way he liked, always short, to bring out your blue eyes, he'd say. "My woman doesn't need to worry about such worldly things," he'd say, kissing my forehead tenderly. I smiled, grateful, feeling pampered like a porcelain doll. How foolish I was. The changes were subtle as poison and honey. First, he locked the telephone in the office. "So you won't get distracted by the neighbors' gossip," he explained, running his hand through my hair like I was a child. Then he stored the car keys in a locked drawer. "A woman driving alone doesn't look good for my reputation in town," he said, kissing my forehead. When my sister Margaret came to visit without warning, he was cold as winter ice. "Dorothy Mae can't receive visitors without scheduling first. This is a serious home, not a social club." I began to feel like a bird in a golden cage. Beautiful cage, good food, comfortable perch, but the bars were real and thick. I couldn't go out alone, not even to church on Sundays without him by my side. I had no money of my own. He controlled even the pennies from grocery money, counting every bill he gave me for shopping. "Write everything in the little notebook," he'd say. "I want to know where every penny went." Gradually, my friends stopped coming. Thomas always had a polite excuse to dismiss them at the door. "Dorothy Mae has a headache today," or "she's busy with household duties." Even letters that came for me went through his hands first. "A husband has to protect his wife from bad influences," he justified, tearing up a letter from my cousin in Birmingham without even showing me what it said. The outside world kept getting more and more distant, like I was sinking in quicksand made of silk and perfume. "You don't understand how dangerous the world is for a delicate woman like you," he repeated when I dared to complain. "There are bad men out there, Dorothy Mae. Communists, bums, no good people. I work hard to protect you from all these dangers." And he'd kiss me, hug me, buy French perfume from Sears, until I felt guilty for questioning his loving protection. But at night, alone in the king-size bed while he worked late in the office, I'd look through the lace curtains at Magnolia Street. I'd see other women driving by alone, free, going wherever they wanted in the darkness. And a small voice inside me whispered, "This isn't protection, Dorothy Mae. This is prison." Still, I kept trying to be the perfect wife. Maybe if I was good enough, obedient enough, quiet enough, maybe he'd loosen the golden leash. It was a Thursday in October, 1966. I remember because it was raining, that fine, persistent Alabama rain that makes everything gray and melancholy. I was in the kitchen preparing the beef stew he liked, using his mother's recipe, being extra careful with the seasoning to make it perfect. Margaret had called earlier, a rare thing, since Thomas didn't like anyone answering the phone without him around. But he was at the sawmill, and when I heard the phone ring, my heart nearly jumped out of my mouth. It was my sister's voice, worried. "Dorothy Mae, are you okay? It's been 2 months since we've talked. Mama's asking about you. She said I looked too thin the last time we saw each other, too sad that my eyes didn't sparkle like they used to. That Thomas isn't even letting you breathe, little sister." We talked for only 10 minutes, but they were the most precious 10 minutes I'd had in months. Laughing with Margaret, hearing family news, feeling like there was still a world beyond the walls of my golden cage. It was like taking a gulp of fresh air after being underwater too long. When Thomas came home from work, his shoes muddy from the rain, I made the fatal mistake of mentioning the call. I was too excited, too happy, and I let it slip. "Thomas, Margaret called today. She wants to come visit us Sunday after church." His eyes changed. It wasn't gradual, it was like flipping a switch. The gentleman who had just walked through the door disappeared, and someone I didn't recognize took his place. His jaw went rigid, the veins in his neck bulged, and he dropped his work briefcase on the floor with a loud thud. "Didn't I tell you not to answer that phone?" His voice came out low, controlled, dangerous, like a rabid dog growling. "Thomas, she's my sister, The first slap came so fast I didn't even see it. The sound echoed through the kitchen like a gunshot, and the metallic taste of blood filled my mouth. For a moment, I was so shocked I couldn't even cry. I just stood there, my hand on my face, trying to understand what had happened. Then he grabbed me by the arm. Those strong fingers I used to admire, gripping my skin like steel claws, leaving purple marks that would last for weeks. "You're going to learn to obey me, Dorothy Mae Sullivan. This is my house, you are my wife, and when I say something, it's not a suggestion. It's an order." He shook me like a rag doll, my feet barely touching the ground. Afterward, like a storm that passes, he collapsed in a chair and cried. Cried like a lost child. "Sorry, honey, sorry. It's just that I love you too much. I can't stand the thought of losing you to those bad influences. You're everything I have, my princess." He pulled me onto his lap, kissed where he had hit, promised between tears that it would never happen again. I believed him, or wanted to believe, because the alternative was accepting that I had married a monster, and I wasn't ready for that terrible truth. But that night, looking in the bathroom mirror at the bruise on my face, something died inside me. The naive Dorothy Mae died in that moment. And in her place, someone was born who would need to be much smarter to survive. In the days that followed, I lived as if I were walking on eggshells. Every step calculated, every word thought 3 times before leaving my mouth. Thomas went back to being the attentive husband, brought flowers, took me to dinner at the fanciest restaurant in Montgomery, bought a gold brooch I hadn't even asked for. "To match your eyes," he said, pinning the jewelry to my blouse with gentle fingers. But I knew that beneath that Southern gentleman mask was a demon waiting for any excuse to come out. And worse, the whole town continued to see Thomas Sullivan as an exemplary man. At church, the ladies commented on how lucky I was. "What an attentive husband you have, Dorothy Mae. Thomas is a true gentleman." If only they knew. I thought about running away. God, how I thought about it. During sleepless nights, I planned. I'd wait for him to fall asleep, grab some hidden money, slip out the back door and run to the train station. But where to? I had no close family who could hide me, no money of my own. And Thomas knew every sheriff within 100 miles. He'd find me in 2 days. That I thought about telling Pastor Williams. But Thomas was the church's biggest contributor, and I was just a wife who might be exaggerating a little domestic squabble. In those years, child, no one interfered between husband and wife. "What happens in the blacksmith's house stays in the blacksmith's house," they'd say. And I had no visible marks. Thomas was too smart for that. That's when I remembered the story Mama used to tell about Grandma Judith. During the Civil War, when the Yankees invaded the farm, she hid all the jewelry and silver buried in the backyard. She spent 3 years pretending to be a poor widow, wearing rags, eating corn porridge, while soldiers took everything they could see. But when the war ended, she dug up the treasure and rebuilt everything, stronger than before. Sometimes, Mama would say, a woman needs to be like a snake, stay quiet in the grass, waiting for the right moment to strike. Grandma Judith survived because she was smarter than the armed men. She didn't fight head-on. That would be suicide. She was patient, strategic, invisible. And I began to understand. I couldn't be stronger than Thomas physically. He had 30 pounds on me and fists that could split tree trunks. But I could be smarter. I could learn to play his game better than he did. That I started small. I observed everything. His schedules, his moods, his habits. I discovered he got more violent when he drank, always bourbon, always after 8 at night. I learned to read the signs, the clenched jaw when he was irritated, the way he drummed his fingers on the table when something bothered him. And most importantly, I discovered that Thomas had secrets. Whispered phone calls in the office after midnight. Papers he kept in a locked drawer. Money that came and went without explanation. A man with secrets is a vulnerable man. But I needed more than observation. I needed evidence. Proof, like the lawyers said on TV. So I began to do something I never imagined I'd be capable of. I began to spy on my own husband. It was dangerous. If he caught me, God knows what he'd do. But I had no choice. It was this or spend the rest of my life as a ghost in my own house. Hoping he wouldn't kill me in one of those fits of rage, I bought a small notebook and began to write down everything. Every assault, every threat, every time he forbade me something. I hid the notebook inside the cover of my Bible. He'd never touch that. A praying woman is a well-behaved woman, he always said. And slowly, very slowly, a plan began to form in my head. It wouldn't be quick, it wouldn't be easy, but it would be definitive. Thomas Sullivan thought he had tamed me, that I was just a submissive and frightened wife. He was very wrong. Because while he slept peacefully beside me, satisfied with his perfect control, I lay awake planning his downfall. And when the time came, and I knew it would, he'd discover that he had completely underestimated the woman he chose to destroy. The opportunity came on a March morning, 1967. Thomas had traveled to Atlanta for a business meeting, something about expanding the sawmill. And for the first time in months, I was alone in the house for more than 2 hours. My heart was beating so hard I swore the neighbors could hear it. I went straight to his office. The door was locked as always, but I knew where he kept the spare key. Inside a fake book on the shelf, Principles of Modern Agriculture. What irony, the man who controlled my life like I was his property hiding secrets in a book about farming. My hands trembled as I turned the key in the lock. The office smelled of leather, tobacco, and that expensive cologne he wore, Old Spice mixed with power. The walls were lined with Chamber of Commerce awards, photographs of him with local politicians, framed certificates. The mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, and behind it, a gray safe that had always made me curious. I started with the desk files. Sawmill contracts, invoices, normal business correspondence. But when I opened the bottom drawer, I found something strange. A folder marked Personal Matters, full of documents that made no sense. Hotel receipts from cities he'd never mentioned, photographs of a blonde woman I didn't know, letters signed, Your Darling Patricia. My stomach dropped. Thomas had a mistress. And it wasn't recent. The letters dated back to 1964, a year before our marriage. While he was courting me at the Baptist church, talking about purity and Christian commitment, he was cheating on another woman too. Or maybe I was the other woman. But there was more. Much more. I found a second folder, marked Taxes Confidential. Inside, copies of tax returns showing very different revenues from those he showed me when I asked about money for the house. Officially, Sullivan Sawmill declared modest profits. But these papers showed cash inflows 3 times larger. Thomas was evading taxes. And these weren't small amounts, thousands of dollars hidden from the federal government. That was guaranteed federal prison if someone found out. I heard a car on the street and nearly died of fright. I ran to the window, but it was just the mailman. Still, my hands were sweating so much I could barely hold the papers. I needed more time, but I also needed to be smart. That's when I saw the Polaroid camera on the shelf. Thomas used it to photograph special wood for clients. Without thinking twice, I began photographing everything. The mistress's letters, the fraudulent tax documents, the suspicious receipts. The camera made that mechanical noise with each photo, and the film came out slowly, revealing the evidence in black and white. But what really changed everything was when I found a third folder, hidden at the bottom of the drawer, marked only with an X. Inside, receipts for payments for special services, signed by sheriffs from 3 different counties. Bribes. Thomas was paying police to ignore his illegal activities. And there was more. Contracts selling lumber to shell companies, schemes to overcharge the government on public contracts, even evidence that he was selling stolen lumber from federal lands. My husband wasn't just an abuser. He was a career criminal. Operating for years under the facade of a respectable man, I photographed everything. Every paper, every receipt, every piece of evidence of crime. The photos accumulated on the desk like cards from a cursed deck. When I finished, I had 43 photographs documenting years of criminal activities. Then I heard the sound I feared most, the motor of his Cadillac in the driveway. Thomas had come back early. My military training, if I can call it that, kicked in. I put everything back exactly as it was, locked the office, put the key back in the fake book, ran to the kitchen and started making coffee as if nothing had happened. The photographs went to the bottom of my sewing box, among the threads and buttons. When he came through the door, I was humming Amazing Grace and stirring sugar into coffee, like the perfect wife he thought he had. "How was your morning, honey?" he asked, kissing my cheek. "Quiet," I replied with the calmest voice I could manage. "I prayed, cleaned the house, made your favorite coffee." He smiled satisfied. "Good girl." But inside I was burning. Not with anger, with power. For the first time since we married, I had something he didn't know I had. Information. Evidence. Weapons. Thomas Sullivan thought he knew me. He thought I was a fragile and submissive wife, incapable of anything beyond obeying and suffering in silence. From that day forward, every smile I gave was a lie. Every yes, dear, was a mask. Because now I knew. I wasn't just a victim in a cage. I was a spy on a mission. And that mission had a very clear objective: collect enough evidence to destroy Thomas Sullivan completely. The 5 years that followed were the hardest of my life. Not because of the punches and slaps, those I already expected. The hard part was living a lie 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Waking up every morning and putting on the mask of the perfect wife, when inside I was building a bomb to explode our life. I learned to be two people at the same time. During the day, I was Dorothy Mae Sullivan, the woman who made cookies for the church charity sale, who smiled when neighbors complimented my garden, who lowered her eyes when Thomas spoke to me in public. But at night, when he slept drunk on bourbon, I transformed into something else. A detective, a spy, a woman with a mission. The routine formed naturally. Thomas always drank too much on Wednesdays and Fridays days. He received financial reports that left him stressed. On those nights, he'd collapse in bed around 10 and sleep like a rock until 6 in the morning. Those were my 8 hours of freedom. I began to study. Not recipe books or embroidery, I studied law. I went to the Montgomery Public Library on those rare trips he allowed me to make, always with a specific list of what to buy, and borrowed books about tax laws, criminal evidence, women's rights. I read everything hidden in the basement by lamplight. Sitting on the cold floor between canned goods, I discovered things that gave me hope. The IRS had a reward program for tax evasion tips. If I could prove Thomas hid more than $50,000, and by my calculations he hid much more, I'd receive a percentage as a prize. Enough money to start life over. More importantly, I discovered that wives could testify against husbands in federal crimes cases. It wasn't like in the movies, where marital privilege protected everything. Tax fraud, bribery of authorities, money laundering, in these crimes I could speak. Then I began phase 2 of the operation, documenting everything systematically. I bought a small recorder, one of those that fit in your palm, at a store in Birmingham when Thomas took me to choose new fabrics. It cost 3 months of grocery money I saved penny by penny, but it was worth every cent the recordings were revealing. Thomas received calls from illegal loggers every week. "The shipment from the National Forest goes out Tuesday," a voice would say. "You sure the sheriff is paid?" Thomas would respond, "Williams gets $500 a month to see nothing. Send it." A 3-minute conversation worth 10 years in federal prison. I recorded him planning to overcharge the construction of the new school. "We'll charge $15,000 for the lumber and deliver $10,000. He explained to an accomplice. "The difference goes to us and the mayor." Corruption, fraud, theft, crime stacked like firewood. But Thomas was also getting more violent. As if he sensed something was changing, even without knowing what. The assaults became more frequent, more calculated. He never hit my face, too smart for that. Ribs, back, places that wouldn't show when I wore a dress to church. One December night 1970, he almost killed me. I had forgotten to hide one of the photographs, evidence of bribery. and it fell from my sewing box when I stumbled on the stairs. Thomas was right behind and saw the photo on the floor. "What's this?" he asked, picking up the paper. My blood turned to ice. It was a photo from the X folder, showing a payment receipt to Sheriff Williams. If he realized what it was. "Oh, that," I said, trying to keep my voice normal. "I found it in your office when I was cleaning. I thought it was trash, was going to throw it away." I prayed my lie sounded convincing. He studied me for long seconds, then tore the photo into pieces. "Don't touch my things, Dorothy May." "Never." This time he beat me with his belt. 10 lashes on my back that left marks for weeks. But I had copies. I always had copies. In 1971, I discovered the safe. Thomas thought I didn't know the combination, but I had observed for months until I memorized the numbers. 1-9-4-7, the year he opened the sawmill. Inside the safe was much more than money. There was the entire structure of his criminal organization. False contracts, lists of bribed officials, records of illegal sales dating back to 1960. Thomas Sullivan wasn't just a criminal. He was the head of a network involving politicians, police, and businessmen from 3 counties. An empire built with stolen lumber and dirty money. And I photographed everything. Every document, every list, every piece of evidence. My photo sessions in the safe always happened in the early hours of Thursday morning, when he slept heavily after meetings with accomplices. I had developed a system, 17 minutes to open the safe, photograph what I needed, and close everything exactly as it was. By 1973, I had more than 300 photographs, 40 hours of recordings, and a notebook with 200 pages of detailed notes. Dates, amounts, names, places. Everything documented with military precision. I kept everything in a box buried in the garden, under the rose bushes he made me plant. The funny thing is, Thomas even complimented me. "You're becoming such an obedient wife, Dorothy May. Finally understood your place." If he knew his obedient wife had enough evidence to send him to federal prison for the rest of his life. But I still needed the right timing. There was no point presenting evidence to just anyone. Several local police were in his scheme. I needed to go straight to the FBI, and I needed to be sure I had protection before taking the first step. That's when I read about Operation Greylord in Chicago, a federal investigation that brought down dozens of corrupt judges using evidence collected by civilian informants. The Time magazine article mentioned a special agent, Robert McKenzie, who was being transferred to Birmingham to lead an anti-corruption task force in the South. This was my chance. A new federal agent in the region with no local connections, no commitment to Thomas's scheme. Someone who would hear my story and see my evidence without warning my husband first. I began planning my escape. Not a physical escape, not yet. A strategic escape. The moment I would step out of the shadows and change from victim to accuser. But Thomas was also planning. And his plan was much more sinister than mine. In January 1975, he began talking about necessary changes. How I was becoming difficult to handle, and might need specialized help. He showed me brochures from a private psychiatric hospital in Mobile. "Sometimes, Dorothy May, when a woman can't adjust to marriage, she needs professional treatment," he said, caressing my face with false tenderness. "Electroshock therapy works wonders for problematic wives." I understood immediately. Thomas was planning to have me forcibly committed to an asylum. In 1970s Alabama, a husband could do this easily. Just needed signatures from 2 doctors saying the wife was unstable. And in there, he could keep me indefinitely, drugged and electroshocked until I became a vegetable. Time was up. It was now or never. That night, while Thomas slept drunk as always on Friday nights, I dug up my evidence box for the last time. Tomorrow, I would call Agent McKenzie from the federal office. 12 years of terror were coming to an end. The call was scheduled for Monday, February 10, 1975. I had memorized the FBI office number in Birmingham, and even rehearsed what I'd say. "My name is Dorothy May Sullivan, and I have evidence of federal crimes committed by my husband." Simple, direct, irreversible. But on Sunday, something went wrong. I was in the kitchen preparing lunch after church when I heard Thomas on the hallway phone. His voice was different, tense, worried. "Are you sure it was her?" he asked someone on the other end. "Dorothy May at the public library? What books?" My blood froze. Someone had seen me. Someone had told Thomas the first was studying law, reading about federal crimes. But who? And how long had he known? I understand, Thomas continued. Yes, I'll handle it. Thank you for the heads up, Sheriff. He hung up and stood in the hallway for long minutes. I could feel him thinking, calculating, planning. When he entered the kitchen, the smile on his face didn't reach his eyes. Honey, he said in a honeyed voice, how about we go for a drive today? There's something I want to show you. Of course, Thomas, I replied, trying to sound natural. Where are we going? Surprise, he said, kissing my forehead. But his fingers squeezed my shoulder too hard, making it clear this wasn't an invitation that we got in the Cadillac, and he drove in silence for 20 minutes, leaving town toward the mountains. My mind raced. Did he know? How much did he know? If he took me somewhere isolated. We stopped in front of Bryce State Hospital, a somber red brick building surrounded by high fences. The place where they sent problematic people, alcoholics, hysterical women, anyone the family wanted to disappear. Do you know what this place is, Dorothy May? Thomas asked, still sitting in the car. A hospital, I replied, my voice coming out weaker than I wanted. A special hospital. For people who've lost touch with reality. Who start fantasizing, making up stories about their own families. He turned to stare at me. People who spend too much time reading books they shouldn't read. So he knew. Maybe not everything, but he knew I was investigating, studying. Sheriff Williams, the same one Thomas bribed, must have had informants at the library, people who reported anything suspicious. Thomas, I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you do. His voice turned icy. Dr. Morrison works here. He's an old family friend, very understanding with husbands who have unstable wives. Just a conversation, a signature, and done. You'd be getting proper treatment. He described the treatment in sadistic detail. Ice baths, straitjackets, electroshock 3 times a week. In 6 months you'd be cured of these strange fantasies. You'd go back to being a normal, obedient wife. But that only happens, he continued, if I discover you're doing something you shouldn't. Reading things you shouldn't read. Thinking things you shouldn't think. He smiled, but it was a predator's smile. For now, I'm just showing you the available options. The ride home was in sepulchral silence. When we arrived, Thomas walked me to the door, took my hand and held it tightly. I hope our conversation clarified some things, Dorothy May. It would be a shame if you made hasty decisions. That night, lying in bed beside him, I knew time had run out. Thomas was suspicious. Maybe he still didn't know about the evidence buried in the garden, but he knew something was happening. And if I took too long to act, I'd wake up in a straitjacket. The FBI call would have to be tomorrow. No matter the risk. It was now or never. On Monday morning I faked a terrible headache. Thomas left for work with a cold kiss on my forehead and the warning. Rest today, honey. And don't do anything strenuous. The threat was clear. As soon as the Cadillac disappeared around the curve, I ran to the phone. My hands trembled so much I dialed the wrong number twice before getting it right. When the professional voice answered, FBI Birmingham office, I almost hung up from nerves. I need to speak with Agent Robert Mackenzie, I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Who can I say is calling? Dorothy May Sullivan. It's about federal crimes in Cedar Grove, Alabama. There was a long pause. Then, one moment, please. The wait lasted an eternity. Every second that passed, I imagined Thomas coming home, finding me on the phone, discovering everything. When Mackenzie finally answered, his voice was careful, professional. Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you have information about criminal activities. Can you give me a general idea of what we're talking about? I took a deep breath. This was it. Tax evasion, bribery of authorities, theft of lumber from federal lands, fraud in public contracts. All documented with photographs and recordings. My husband has been operating for 15 years. Silence on the other end. Then, what kind of documentation do you have exactly? 347 photographs of financial documents, 42 hours of recordings of criminal conversations, 200 pages of notes with dates, amounts, and names. Everything kept in a secure location. Mrs. Sullivan, these are very serious accusations. I need to meet with you personally to evaluate this evidence. But can I guarantee your safety? No. Honestly. My husband suspects something. Yesterday he took me to see a psychiatric hospital, made it clear he can have me committed at any time. I understand. How about we meet tomorrow noon at the Montgomery Public Library? It's neutral ground, public, safe. We set the meeting. When I hung up, my legs were shaking. I had done it. I had taken the first step to destroy Thomas Sullivan. There was no going back. But the day was just beginning. Around 3 in the afternoon, Thomas came home early. His expression was strange, not angry, but thoughtful, like he was solving a complex puzzle. "How's your headache, honey?" he asked, taking off his jacket. "Better, thank you. I rested all morning." He nodded slowly. "Good. Because tonight we'll have dinner guests. Sheriff Williams and Mayor Davis are coming to discuss some business." My heart raced. A meeting of the 3 most powerful men in the county at my house right now? It couldn't be a coincidence. "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll prepare that roast you like." "No need." His voice turned cold. "They're not coming for dinner. They're coming to talk about security problems in the region." At 7 at night, the 3 men locked themselves in Thomas's office. I served bourbon and cigars, playing my role as invisible wife, but managed to catch fragments of the conversation. Public library books about law. Mrs. Patterson at the salon said she asked strange questions. "We can't take risks. Operation too big." When they finally left around 10, Thomas came to the kitchen where I was washing dishes. He stood behind me for long minutes just watching. "Dorothy May," he said finally, "have you been a faithful wife all these years?" "Of course, Thomas. Why do you ask?" "Faithful in every aspect. Honest. Loyal. Without secrets." I kept washing dishes, trying to keep my hands steady. "I have no secrets from you. Are you sure?" He approached, putting his hands on my shoulders. Because sometimes when a person lies for a long time, they forget where the lie ends and the truth begins. His fingers squeezed my shoulders with increasing force. "And when we discover that someone we love is lying, well, that hurts a lot. A lot." The pressure increased until I grimaced in pain. "Thomas, you're hurting me." "Am I?" He released, feigning surprise. "Sorry, honey. Sometimes I don't know my own strength." He kissed the top of my head. "Finish up there and let's go to bed. Tomorrow is an important day." That night, lying beside him, I heard Thomas talking in his sleep. Loose words, fragments of nightmares. "Can't know. Too dangerous. Has to disappear." At one point he turned and whispered, still sleeping, "Forgive me, Dorothy May. You forced me to do this." I froze. He was planning something. Maybe he didn't know exactly what I had discovered, but he knew enough to consider me a threat that needed to be eliminated at T4 in the morning. Unable to pretend I was sleeping anymore, I got up quietly and went to the kitchen. I needed a plan. The meeting with Mackenzie was in 8 hours, but what if Thomas didn't let me leave? What if he decided to have me committed today? That's when I saw the office light on. Thomas was in there on the phone, speaking quietly. "Yes, Dr. Morrison. A sudden nervous breakdown, aggressive, dangerous, needs immediate commitment." My blood turned to ice. He was talking to the psychiatrist at Bryce Hospital, arranging my commitment for today. He'd probably come home with an ambulance and 2 men in white coats. That I went back to the bedroom in panic. I had to leave the house before Thomas officially woke up. I had to get to the meeting with Mackenzie and hand over all the evidence before they locked me in a straitjacket. I looked at the man sleeping beside me, the man who had terrorized me for 12 years, who was planning to destroy me completely to protect his dirty secrets. In a few hours, one of us would have won this silent war, and I intended for it to be me. At 5:30 in the morning, I dressed silently in the bathroom and left through the back door. Thomas was still sleeping heavily, but I knew that in 2 hours he would wake up and discover my escape. There was no more time for subtlety. I went straight to the garden, dug under the white rose bushes and grabbed my evidence box. 12 years of terror summarized in a shoebox wrapped in plastic. It weighed only 3 pounds, but carried the weight of a lifetime. That I took the 6 o'clock bus to Montgomery. First time in years I had traveled alone. Every mile took me away from the golden prison, brought me closer to freedom. But it also brought me closer to the most dangerous moment of my life. That I arrived at the public library at 11:30. Agent Mackenzie was already there. A tall man about 40 years old, graying hair, blue eyes that seemed to see through people. I recognized in him the same look I had developed, someone used to dealing with liars and criminals. Mrs. Sullivan. He stood up from a table in the most private corner. Agent Mackenzie. I shook his hand, noticing how firm and reliable it was. I brought everything. I placed the box on the table between us. When I opened it, I saw his eyes widen. 347 photographs organized by date and type of crime. 42 numbered and labeled cassette tapes. 200 pages of detailed notes in my careful handwriting. My God, Mackenzie murmured, leafing through the photographs. This is a complete file of a criminal organization. He stopped at a photo showing a bribery receipt. This is Sheriff Williams? $500 a month since 1968, I confirmed. And there's more. Mayor Davis gets $1,000. Judge Morrison from the county court gets $2,000 to ensure cases get dismissed. Mackenzie turned on a small recorder. Mrs. Sullivan, I'm recording our conversation with your permission. Are you willing to testify officially about these crimes? Yes. My voice came out firm without hesitation. I'm willing to testify about everything. For 2 hours I told the whole story. The 12 years of abuse, the gradual discovery of the crimes, the evidence I collected risking my life. Mackenzie listened in silence, occasionally asking for clarification, always respectful, always believing. Mrs. Sullivan, what you've done here. This is extraordinary. We have enough evidence to prosecute not just your husband, but an entire network of corruption that infects 3 counties. He paused, studying my face. But you understand the risks? These people won't simply accept prison. They'll fight. I know, I replied. But I can't live in fear anymore. And I can't let them continue destroying other lives. Mackenzie nodded with respect. Here's what we'll do. Today we start the arrests. Coordinated operation with the FBI, IRS, and state police. We won't notify anyone local. We assume the entire county police force is compromised. At 3 in the afternoon, I returned to Cedar Grove. When I got off the bus at the town square, I saw the city was agitated. FBI, IRS, and state police cars were parked in front of Sullivan's sawmill. Federal agents were coming and going carrying boxes of documents that I walked slowly home, knowing it was the last time I would make that journey as Thomas Sullivan's wife that I found him in the garden, on his knees among the destroyed rose bushes, desperately digging where my evidence box used to be. When he saw me, his face contorted in a mixture of rage and despair. Where is it? He screamed, getting up with hands dirty from soil. Where did you hide the photographs? They're not hidden anymore, I said calmly. They're with the FBI. What happened next was like watching a man crumble in slow motion. Thomas Sullivan, the respected man, the pillar of the community, the controlling husband, collapsed. Literally and figuratively. You don't know what you've done, he whispered, tears mixed with dirt on his face. You destroyed everything. The company, my reputation, our life. Our life. I laughed, and it was a bitter sound that even scared me. Thomas, you never gave me a life. You gave me a prison. You gave me 12 years of terror. But I loved you, he screamed. Everything I did was to protect you, to give you a good life. No. My voice was calm, final. You loved me like a man loves a doll. Something pretty to put on the shelf and control. That's not love, Thomas. That's possession. That's when the cars arrived. 4 black vehicles, federal agents getting out in military formation. Mackenzie was among them, and when our eyes met, he nodded respectfully. Thomas Sullivan, said a tall agent reading an official document. You're under arrest for tax evasion, bribery of federal authorities, fraud in public contracts, and theft of federal property. The handcuffs made a metallic sound when they closed on Thomas's wrists. He looked at me one last time, and there was no more anger in his eyes, just a deep emptiness. Did you really hate me that much? He asked. No, irraplía honestly. I loved you. That's why I stayed so long. But you turned that love into fear, and fear into hatred. And when I discovered who you really were, well, you made your choice 15 years ago. I just documented the consequences. When the police car disappeared taking Thomas Sullivan away, I stood alone in the destroyed garden. The rose bushes were uprooted, the soil turned over, fragments of our life scattered across the ground. But for the first time in 12 years, I breathed fresh air. Mackenzie approached. Mrs. Sullivan will need you for a few more statements, but the worst is over. And there's a federal reward for the information you provided. $250,000. $250,000. Enough money to start over, to be whoever I wanted to be. Thank you, I said simply. When everyone left, I entered the empty house. I sat in the leather chair that was always his, picked up the golden keys to the office from the table. For 12 years, these keys represented my prison. Now they represented my freedom. In the 3 months that followed, Cedar Grove was turned upside down. Thomas Sullivan's arrest was just the beginning. A stone that rolled downhill, causing an avalanche that destroyed everything in its path. Sheriff Williams was arrested a week later. Mayor Davis tried to flee to Mexico, but was intercepted at the border. Judge Morrison had a heart attack in jail before the trial even began. Within 6 months, 23 people were indicted for federal crimes. The corruption network Thomas built crumbled like a house of cards. And I was at the center of it all, as the woman who brought down the system. The town's reaction was complicated. Half the people saw me as a hero, the brave woman who exposed corruption and brought justice. The other half saw me as a traitor, the wife who sold out her own husband and destroyed respectable families. At the Baptist church where Thomas was a deacon, I was met with whispers and judgmental looks. Domestic problems are solved at home, muttered Mrs. Patterson. A Christian wife forgives and prays for her husband. I stopped going to services after 3 weeks. But there were surprises too. Margaret, my sister, came to visit me for the first time in years. I always knew something was wrong, she said, hugging me tight on the porch. You had changed so much after the marriage. I lost my cheerful little sister and got a sad, scared stranger. Why didn't you ever say anything? I asked. I tried. Remember that time I asked if you were okay? Thomas dismissed me at the door and said you were indisposed. After that, whenever I called, he would answer and say you couldn't talk. Margaret shook her head. I should have insisted more. The house on Magnolia Street became a burden. Neighbors drove by slowly, pointing and commenting. That's where the woman who turned in her husband to the government lives. Children threw rocks at the windows. Someone painted "traitor" on the front fence. But the worst were the threats. Anonymous letters saying I would pay dearly for what I did. Phone calls in the middle of the night with disguised voices promising to deliver justice. One day, I found a dead cat on the porch with a note. You're next. Agent Mackenzie offered federal protection, but I refused. I won't live in hiding, I said. I've lived too long in fear. Instead, I bought a shotgun and learned to shoot. Anyone who wanted to intimidate me would discover that Dorothy Mae Sullivan was no longer the fragile woman she used to be. Thomas's trial was a media circus. Journalists from Atlanta, Birmingham, and even New York came to town. The wife who brought down an empire. Read the Atlanta Constitution headline. Housewife turns detective to destroy criminal husband. When I testified, the courtroom was packed. Thomas looked at me throughout the testimony, but there was no longer anger in his eyes, just deep sadness, as if he finally understood he had lost everything because of his own greed and violence. The sentence was 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for the first 15 years. At 52, Thomas Sullivan left the courthouse in handcuffs, wearing an orange jumpsuit, on his way to a federal penitentiary in Texas. We never spoke again. With the federal reward money and the confiscated assets that were returned to me after the trial, I had resources to start over wherever I wanted. The question was, where could a 43-year-old woman, widow of a federal criminal, build a new life? The answer came in an unexpected letter from a distant cousin in Oregon. If you want a place to start over away from all this mess, she wrote, we have a little house here in Salem. It's small, but it has a view of the mountains and nobody knows your story. Oregon, a state where no one knew who Dorothy Mae Sullivan was. Where I could just be Dorothy Mae. Salem, Oregon, was everything Cedar Grove wasn't. Mountains covered with pine trees instead of cotton hills. Fine, constant rain instead of suffocating heat. And silence, a deep, clean silence I hadn't known for 15 years. My cousin's little house was on a quiet street called Maple Lane. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a porch facing the Cascade Mountains. Simple, honest, with no secrets hidden in locked drawers. When I first entered in September 1976, I cried for a whole hour just from relief. But freedom, I discovered, is more frightening than it seems. For the first time in 15 years, no one told me what to do. No one controlled my money, my food, my schedule. I could go out whenever I wanted, talk to whoever I wanted, read whatever I wanted. It was terrifying that in the first weeks, I woke up at 5 in the morning, the time Thomas always woke up, and lay there waiting for orders that never came. I made coffee for 2 people out of pure habit. I asked permission from the empty television before remembering I didn't need permission for anything anymore. The silence was the hardest. For years, I had lived on a razor's edge, always listening. His footsteps in the hallway, the jingling of keys, the tone of voice that indicated his mood. Now nothing. Just the wind in the pine trees and the distant sound of traffic. Some nights, the silence drove me crazy. I'd turn on the radio just to hear human voices. I'd go to the store just to greet the cashier. Anything to remember there were still people in the world. Other nights, the silence was a gift from God. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, something Thomas hated, and just breathe. Breathe without fear, without calculating every movement, without preparing for the next explosion of rage. That I began to rediscover myself gradually. Who was Dorothy May before Thomas? What books did I like to read? What food did I prefer? What clothes would I choose if no one else decided for me? Simple questions that became journeys of exploration, that I discovered I liked mysteries. Agatha Christie books fascinated me. I discovered I preferred mild coffee to the strong kind Thomas demanded. I discovered I looked good in blue, a color he always said made me look washed out. But the scars were deep. Months after the move, I still jumped when someone knocked at the door. I still checked the locks 3 times before sleeping. I still woke up in the middle of the night thinking I heard the Cadillac's engine in the driveway. The mirror was my biggest challenge. For years, I had avoided looking at myself. Thomas always commented on my appearance, always found flaws. You're getting fat. That haircut doesn't suit you. Smile more, you look bitter. Now, looking at my reflection at 44, I tried to see beyond his criticisms that I saw a marked woman, but not a broken one. Graying hair I could cut however I wanted. Blue eyes that had seen horrors, but had also found strength. Hands that sometimes trembled, but had held a camera for 12 years, documenting crimes, building an escape. That I occasionally received letters from Margaret, updates about the trial, news from Cedar Grove. Thomas was in federal prison in El Paso. He asked about you. Margaret wrote in one letter. Said to tell you he still loves you. I tore up the letter without finishing reading it. Thomas Sullivan's love was poison wrapped in gift paper. Now I knew the difference. Christmas 1976. I sat alone in my small kitchen, watching snow fall on the mountains. For the first time in years, the silence didn't scare me. It was the sound of peace. In the 3 months that followed, Cedar Grove was turned upside down. Thomas Sullivan's arrest was just the beginning, a stone that rolled downhill, causing an avalanche that destroyed everything in its path. Sheriff Williams was arrested a week later. Mayor Davis tried to flee to Mexico but was intercepted at the border. Judge Morrison had a heart attack in jail before the trial even began. Within 6 months, 23 people were indicted for federal crimes. The corruption network Thomas built crumbled like a house of cards. And I was at the center of it all as the woman who brought down the system. The town's reaction was complicated. Half the people saw me as a hero, the brave woman who exposed corruption and brought justice. The other half saw me as a traitor, the wife who sold out her own husband and destroyed respectable families. At the Baptist church where Thomas was a deacon, I was met with whispers and judgmental looks. Domestic problems are solved at home, muttered Mrs. Patterson. A Christian wife forgives and prays for her husband. I stopped going to services after 3 weeks. But there were surprises too. Margaret, my sister, came to visit me for the first time in years. I always knew something was wrong, she said, hugging me tight on the porch. You had changed so much after the marriage. I lost my cheerful little sister and got a sad, scared stranger. Why didn't you ever say anything? I asked. I tried. Remember that time I asked if you were okay? Thomas dismissed me at the door and said you were indisposed. After that, whenever I called, he would answer and say you couldn't talk. Margaret shook her head. I should have insisted more. The house on Magnolia Street became a burden. Neighbors drove by slowly, pointing and commenting. That's where the woman who turned in her husband to the government lives. Children threw rocks at the windows. Someone painted traitor on the front fence. But the worst were the threats. Anonymous letters saying I would pay dearly for what I did. Phone calls in the middle of the night with disguised voices promising to deliver justice. One day, I found a dead cat on the porch with a note. You're next. Agent McKinsey offered federal protection, but I refused. I won't live in hiding, I said. I've lived too long in fear. Instead, I bought a shotgun and learned to shoot. Anyone who wanted to intimidate me would discover that Dorothy Mae Sullivan was no longer the fragile woman she used to be. Thomas's trial was a media circus. Journalists from Atlanta, Birmingham, and even New York came to town. The wife who brought down an empire, read the Atlanta Constitution headline. Housewife turns detective to destroy criminal husband. When I testified, the courtroom was packed. Thomas looked at me throughout the testimony, but there was no longer anger in his eyes, just deep sadness, as if he finally understood he had lost everything because of his own greed and violence. The sentence was 25 years in federal prison without possibility of parole for the first 15 years. At 52, Thomas Sullivan left the courthouse in handcuffs, wearing an orange jumpsuit, on his way to a federal penitentiary in Texas. We never spoke again. With the federal reward money and the confiscated assets that were returned to me after the trial, I had resources to start over wherever I wanted. The question was, where could a 43-year-old woman, widow of a federal criminal, build a new life? The answer came in an unexpected letter from a distant cousin in Oregon. If you want a place to start over away from all this mess, she wrote, we have a little house here in Salem. It's small, but it has a view of the mountains and nobody knows your story. Oregon. A state where no one knew who Dorothy Mae Sullivan was. Where I could just be Dorothy Mae. Salem, Oregon was everything Cedar Grove wasn't. Mountains covered with pine trees instead of cotton hills. Fine, constant rain instead of suffocating heat. And silence, a deep, clean silence I hadn't known for 15 years. My cousin's little house was on a quiet street called Maple Lane. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen. A porch facing the Cascade Mountains. Simple, honest, with no secrets hidden in locked drawers. When I first entered in September 1976, I cried for a whole hour just from relief. But freedom, I discovered, is more frightening than it seems. For the first time in 15 years, no one told me what to do. No one controlled my money, my food, my schedule. I could go out whenever I wanted, talk to whoever I wanted, read whatever I wanted. It was terrifying that in the first weeks, I woke up at 5 in the morning, the time Thomas always woke up, and lay there waiting for orders that never came. I made coffee for 2 people out of pure habit. I asked permission from the empty television before remembering I didn't need permission for anything anymore. The silence was the hardest. For years I had lived on a razor's edge, always listening. His footsteps in the hallway, the jingling of keys, the tone of voice that indicated his mood. Now nothing. Just the wind in the pine trees and the distant sound of traffic. Some nights the silence drove me crazy. I'd turn on the radio just to hear human voices. I'd go to the store just to greet the cashier. Anything to remember there were still people in the world. Other nights the silence was a gift from God. I'd sit on the porch with a cup of tea, something Thomas hated, and just breathe. Breathe without fear, without calculating every movement, without preparing for the next explosion of rage. I began to rediscover myself gradually. Who was Dorothy Mae before Thomas? What books did I like to read? What food did I prefer? What clothes would I choose if no one else decided for me? Simple questions that became journeys of exploration. I discovered I liked mysteries. Agatha Christie books fascinated me. I discovered I preferred mild coffee to the strong kind Thomas demanded. I discovered I looked good in blue, a color he always said made me look washed out. But the scars were deep. Months after the move, I still jumped when someone knocked at the door. I still checked the locks 3 times before sleeping. I still woke up in the middle of the night thinking I heard the Cadillac's engine in the driveway. The mirror was my biggest challenge. For years, I had avoided looking at myself. Thomas always commented on my appearance, always found flaws. You're getting fat. That haircut doesn't suit you. Smile more, you look bitter. Now, looking at my reflection at 44, I tried to see beyond his criticisms that I saw a marked woman, but not a broken one. Graying hair I could cut however I wanted. Blue eyes that had seen horrors, but had also found strength. Hands that sometimes trembled, but had held a camera for 12 years, documenting crimes, building and escaped. I occasionally received letters from Margaret, updates about the trial, news from Cedar Grove. Thomas was in federal prison in El Paso. He asked about you, Margaret wrote in one letter. Said to tell you he still loves you. I tore up the letter without finishing reading it. Thomas Sullivan's love was poison wrapped in gift paper. Now I knew the difference. At Christmas 1976, I sat alone in my small kitchen, watching snow fall on the mountains. For the first time in years, the silence didn't scare me. It was the sound of peace. The change began on a March morning, 1978. I was at the store when I heard an argument in the parking lot. A man yelling at a woman holding a small child. You're worthless, he screamed. Can't even shop right. The woman cowered, protecting her son, whispering apologies. That I saw my own past in that scene. The fear in her eyes, the way she made herself small, the frightened child watching. Without thinking, I approached. Excuse me, I said to the man, keeping my voice calm but firm. Is there a problem here? He looked at me with disdain. None of your business, lady. Anything that happens in a public place is my business. I looked directly at the woman. Are you okay? Do you need help? The woman, couldn't have been more than 25, looked at me with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Everything's fine, she murmured. Just a misunderstanding. But I knew that misunderstanding. I knew that fear. My name is Dorothy May, I said, ignoring the husband who was huffing with rage. I live on Maple Lane, house 47. If you need anything to talk, a safe place, whatever, my door is always open. The man pulled the woman by the arm. Let's go, Linda. Don't need to talk to crazy strangers. They left quickly, but Linda looked back and waved discreetly. 3 days later, she showed up at my door with her son and a small suitcase. She had a bruise on her face and her arm in an improvised sling. You said the door was open, she whispered. And it is, I replied, making way. Kumein. You're safe here. Linda stayed with me for 2 weeks. During that time, I told my story, not all the sordid details but the essentials. How I recognized the signs, how I documented the abuse, how I found courage to leave. She listened in silence, sometimes crying, sometimes nodding in recognition. I thought it was just me, she said one night. I thought I provoked him, that I deserved it. No woman deserves to be treated like property, I replied. And you're not alone. There are more women like us than you imagine. I helped Linda find an apartment, a job, a lawyer. When she finally left my house, she was a different person, still scared, still scarred, but with a plan and hope. Word spread quietly. Other women began to appear. Some seeking advice, others needing a safe place to spend the night. Some just wanting to talk to someone who understood. That I discovered I had a gift for this. Maybe because I had been through hell myself, I knew exactly what to say and, more importantly, when to stay quiet and just listen. My small house became an unofficial refuge for women in crisis. In 1979, the county social worker, Karen Morrison, approached me. Dorothy, you're doing incredible work here. Have you thought about formalizing this? The state has training programs for domestic trauma counselors. At 46, I went back to school. It wasn't easy, decades away from school, emotional scars that sometimes interfered with concentration. But I had purpose now. Every psychology book, every trauma class, every certification I earned was a weapon against men like Thomas. When I received my counselor certificate 2 years later, I had helped 17 women escape abusive relationships. Some went back to their husbands, and that broke my heart. Others completely rebuilt their lives. But what marked me most was a letter I received from Linda. Dorothy, you saved me. But more than that, you showed me I could save myself. My son is growing up in a house without screaming, without fear. He'll never see his mother diminished by any man. That's your gift to the future. I realized then that my 12 years of hell weren't just useless suffering. They were training. preparation for something bigger. Thomas may have tried to destroy me, but in the end, he transformed me into a weapon against men like him. Today, at 78, I still live in the little house on Maple Lane. The front garden is full of rose bushes, but these are different from the ones Thomas forced me to plant. These I chose. Vibrant red roses that bloom wild, without pruning, without control. I in the living room, where once there was only silence, now there's a piano. An upright piano I bought at a liquidation sale in 1982 and learned to play by myself, at 49. Thomas always said music was unnecessary noise. Now I play every morning, hymns, jazz, even rock and roll when I'm feeling rebellious. The walls are covered with photographs, but they're not photos of criminal evidence. They're photos of women who passed through my house. Linda with her college diploma, Maria on her wedding day with the man who treats her like a princess, Sarah with children who now grow up without fear. 53 women over 40 years. 53 lives that changed course. Above the fireplace in a simple frame is my divorce certificate. I managed to annul the marriage in 1980, when Thomas was still in prison. Officially, Dorothy Mae Sullivan ceased to exist. I went back to being Dorothy Mae Henderson. The woman I was before he tried to destroy me. I in the afternoons, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea. I still prefer tea to coffee, and watch the mountains. Sometimes young women stop to talk. Word gets around that the lady from Maple Lane understands certain things, knows how to give advice that saves lives. Yesterday, a 20-year-old girl came to me crying. My boyfriend won't let me work, she sobbed. Says it's because he loves me too much to leave me alone in the world. I held her hands and said what I always say. Honey, love doesn't forbid. Love doesn't control. Love doesn't diminish. If someone is trying to make you small, it's not love, it's fear in disguise. Tonight, I'll play piano until late. Maybe Amazing Grace, the song they played at my wedding 53 years ago. But now when I play, I don't think of broken promises. I think of promises kept. The promise I made to myself to never again accept less than I deserve. And I deserve music. I deserve peace. I deserve a life without fear. Those golden keys are still on my nightstand. Not because they represent victory over Thomas. That war ended decades ago. They're there because they represent something much more powerful. The key to my own freedom. If you're hearing this story, child, maybe it's because you recognize something familiar in it. Maybe you have someone in your life who controls, who diminishes, who says they do everything for love. Maybe you are that person living in a golden cage, thinking you have no choice. Let me tell you a secret I learned at 78. There's always a choice. It may not seem like it may be scary, it may seem impossible, but there's always a way out. Sometimes, we just need to be patient and smart enough to find the key. Thomas Sullivan died in prison in 1991, at 67. I found out through a letter from a lawyer handling his final affairs. I felt nothing. No relief, no sadness. Just the closing of a chapter that had ended long ago. He took 12 years of my life, but he couldn't take what mattered. My strength, my intelligence, my capacity to love and be truly loved. Revenge? No. What I did wasn't revenge. It was justice. And justice, child, isn't about destroying those who hurt us. It's about stopping them from hurting other people. It's about transforming our pain into protection for others. Now, if this story touched your heart in any way, leave a comment telling your own story. And if you know someone who needs to hear these words, share it. Because sometimes, a grandmother's story can be exactly the light someone needs to find their own way out of the darkness. This is Dorothy Mae Henderson, from Salem, Oregon. And remember, you're stronger than you imagine.